Will you state your full name?
My name's Teresa Olszowy.
Okay, and spell your last name for us.
And it's spelled, the last name's spelled Olszowy.
Okay, great. Now, what branch of military did you serve in, and what dates did you serve?
I served with the United States Army. I began my career as an ROTC cadet at Syracuse University in September 1978. I was commissioned second lieutenant in May of 1982 and served as an officer in the United States Army Ordnance Corps until December of 1991. I separated service as a captain.
Okay. What influenced you to go into the military?
Actually, I had a cousin who several years prior had received an ROTC scholarship, and it was a tuition-paid scholarship, and I thought I'd take a crack at it, and lo and behold, I ended up with a 4-year scholarship, tuition scholarship through Syracuse, which required initially a 4-year active duty service obligation with an additional 2-year reserve. I ended up spending actually 9 years on active duty. And it was one of those procrastination deals. I was enjoying myself, having a good time. And just 4 years turned into 9. So,
what did you have to do to qualify for the ROTC scholarship?
it was a mix of academics and community leadership skills. They judged you not only on your standardized scores like SATs, but you also had to take a physical exam, and there was a personal interview that you had to go through with several active duty officers. I don't recall the numbers, but it was a fairly large nationwide competition.
Do you know approximately how many of the students you served with, or you went to school with at Syracuse, were on ROTC scholarships? Do you know?
Oof.
There were a lot?
I think my freshman year, I think there were 18 of us that were on scholarship, but there were a variety of others because in addition to the 4-year scholarship, you could also get a 1, 2, or 3-year scholarship depending on what year in school you were, whether or not there was a vacancy in the program, and whether or not you'd shown the aptitude and interest to go forward.
Do you think it was a very competitive program?
Most definitely.
Okay.
There was an academic requirement where you were required to maintain a certain GPA as far as that goes, plus the fact that your final grade point average and your final ranking after your summer camp determined whether or not you got your first selection of branch choice when you graduated. It also helped influence your assignment and choice of where you wanted to go. When you entered your senior year, what you did is you selected one of 5 different branches throughout the military, and then people were selected and placed in the branches based upon their academic excellence, their field performance exercises that had happened the previous summer during your junior year at summer camp, which was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
What did you do at summer camp?
Summer camp is basically your proving ground. You go out, you execute your field skills. They teach you leadership skills. You and a number of other students up and down the eastern seacoast went to Fort Bragg that summer. The Midwest went to Fort Riley, and the Far West ended up at Fort Lewis, Washington for their summer camps. And you were placed in a company of a number of other, I don't recall the size of the companies, it might have been 50 of us in a company, and each day we were rotated through leadership positions, whether it be the company commander, one of the lieutenant platoon leaders, or a squad leader. We'd go out on field training exercises, be given a mission, leadership reaction courses, which of course were always fun. They have areas painted that are off limits, and they give you this great big huge ditch you have to cross that's 15 feet wide and a board that's only 14 feet wide, and you have to figure out how to get everybody from one side to the other side without touching the water, kind of activities. And it's more to test your decision-making skills and see how well you work as a team. It was a lot of fun. Met a lot of snakes, a lot of ticks, a lot of little chiggers, nasty little red bugs. But all in all, it was an enjoyable experience that I probably wouldn't trade now. At the time, I was less than ecstatic about the conditions. Coming from upstate New York in May, where it snowed graduation weekend, going to Fort Bragg in July in 100-degree temperatures, it was a bit of a shock. But once you get acclimatized to it, it wasn't bad. After that, you go back to Syracuse for your final year, and then you got branched and went off to your officer basic school.
When you were at summer camp, did you have the feeling that you were being prepared to be a soldier, or was it more fun? Was it?
Oh, absolutely. It was dead serious. You used the equipment. Everything that you did, you were learning the skills because you were ultimately going to become an officer. You had to know what your soldiers were going to do, and they had to have the confidence in you that you knew what you were doing in order to be able to gain their respect and do what you had to do as their platoon leader or ultimately company commander. Absolutely dead serious, very competitive environment. Again, like I said, it was one of those. Of course, everybody was wanting to be an officer, and it was a gung-ho attitude. You had cadets from VMI, cadets from the Citadel, people from small military colleges, and people from large public universities like myself, and we were all thrown in, mixed together. And some of us had more knowledge, particularly those from military schools, where those of us who were civilian colleges didn't necessarily know how to make the bunks and square the edges and bounce the quarters. But within 2 or 3 weeks, we were all pretty much at the same level. That's how competitive it was.
Why would you have selected the Army? I mean, think 5 years before you started this, would you have envisioned yourself in the Army?
Possibly, but I don't know. My father had served in the Korean War in the Navy. He did his time and left. The family was, I guess you could say, a regimented family. One was in the healthcare profession and one was in the law enforcement profession. So uniforms weren't necessarily unknown. A regimented lifestyle wasn't necessarily unknown. I don't think that I ever gave it a thought that I was going to grow up and become an officer. Initially, I think it was a means to an end to help me pay for a college education that I probably wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. But in the process, I made a lot of friends, learned a lot of things, and I heartily enjoyed myself. Had an opportunity to do things that you never had to do. Saw some things that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily have seen. Enjoyed a sense of camaraderie and fraternity, if you will, that I haven't found on the outside.
What things did you see that you don't think other people would have had the chance to see?
It's hard to put into words. The experiences that you have at the time, you probably don't think about it, but in retrospect, you look at incidents and activities throughout your career that you wonder what somebody who's never been through in a situation where your decision depends on whether somebody's killed or not killed. It's a very different type of responsibility, especially as a brand new second lieutenant. You turn around and you look at 35 smiling faces looking back at you, and you're sitting in West Germany, probably 30 kilometers from the Czechoslovakian border in the early 80s, at the height of the Cold War, knowing that at any time somebody could come across the border, and that all of a sudden you were in charge, and whether or not you made the right decision or wrong decision, the lives of the soldiers in your platoon or company depended on what you did, whether you did it right or wrong. You stop and think about that. It's kind of an awesome responsibility at age 22 or at age 23. It's not something you think about at the time, but in retrospect, there was a lot of pressure there.
When did you find out you were going to Germany?
It was right out of Officer Basic School. What you do after you graduate from college, every branch of the service has a qualification course that you go to. It's anywhere from 4 to 6 months long, depending on the branch of service you're in and how technical the training is. Mine was about 5.5 months. And based on your performance there, your desires again, you listed where you would prefer to go in order of preference, and then depending on the openings and vacancies that units had, they would assign you based on your performance, your academic performance, your leadership performance at the basic school. So when I left Aberdeen Proving Grounds, I knew I was going to Germany. I didn't know exactly where at the time, but...
Where did that rank on your list of preferences?
It was number one.
Okay.
I wanted an opportunity to go someplace where I hadn't been. I figured I could always travel the States or find a stateside assignment. But overseas assignments were not always popular, particularly with young married couples that had families. A lot of people simply didn't want to travel overseas. My first preference was Germany. My second preference was Korea.
In Germany, where did you serve?
I served with the 7th Corps. It was a Corps level unit as opposed to a division. The company I was assigned to, the 66 Maintenance Company, was actually on a post with the 3rd Infantry Division. As the member of the 66 Maintenance Company, we were responsible for providing ground support maintenance for, basically, if it didn't fly or explode, we fixed it. If it had a wheel or track on it, we were responsible for rebuilding engines, transmissions, fixing trucks, tanks, half-tracks, personnel carriers, things of that nature, small arms. We also had a small service evacuation recovery section, and that usually entailed if a unit was out and a vehicle broke down, our responsibility was to go retrieve the vehicle, bring it back to a point where it could be repaired. We also had, we serviced the 3rd Infantry Division, and 1st Armored Division, and the 2nd Armored Cavalry Division, which was the border guard in southern Germany. We were located in the Wurzburg area, which is about halfway between Frankfurt and Nuremberg. Beautiful part of the country. It had a fairly rich history during World War II. The major assemblies point that I was in charge of was right on the edge of an airstrip that had seen heavy bombing during World War II. And at times you could look down our yard and you could see where the yard kind of twisted and turned, and you could see where there had been prior macadam and cement where bombs had fallen. And when they were excavating for the new tank park, when the 3rd Infantry Division received their M1 Abrams tanks, when they were first fielded, they located 2 500-pound unexploded ordnance bombs under the ground, which was probably within 100 yards of my yard. That was kind of an exciting experience.
What did they do with them?
They call in the explosive ordnance folks, and they come in and check them to make sure that they're not live, and if they do, they detonate them.
Do you remember if they were live?
I don't believe they were. They picked them up and removed them, but there were cases where there were live bombs still being found, particularly in Berlin. They'd find them down in the sewer systems and places like that. But it was not unusual to find unexploded ordnance at any given time. You just had to be real careful. It was an exciting day that day. The MPs come through and we were evacuated for about 3 or 4 days until they removed the ordnance. It was interesting.
Can you take me through a typical day while you were in Germany? Just a typical day from dawn to dusk.
In garrison, when we were on post and not in the field, you generally had a 3-day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday physical fitness schedule. That usually started at 6 o'clock in the morning. Your calisthenics, your extended 2, 3, 4, 5 mile runs, depending on how far you wanted to go that day. Then you came back, you'd break, the troops would go to breakfast at the mess hall. That was pretty much the officers' time to do what they needed to do, clean up, take care of any personal paperwork. And then there was a morning formation, usually about 8 o'clock, where the first sergeant read the orders for the day, posted the details, let everybody know what was coming up, and then the soldiers would break and go to their individual sections, their individual platoons. The officers would go to their platoons, to their company headquarters, or take care of a number of additional duties that are outside of being a platoon leader, things like being the training officer or the public affairs officer or the Red Cross liaison. There's a number of different things that have to be done to support a company, and all that gets farmed out to the lieutenants to do as additional duties. So you spent your day doing that. You would spend time inspecting the troops. You could ultimately end up pulling duty on post as a staff duty officer, which basically you're the go-to person for questions and answers if something goes wrong. And then you break for lunch, and then about either at 4:30, 5 o'clock would be the end of the day. The troops would break, go back to their barracks, and that would be their time. And the officers, if you weren't on duty, then you'd break and go to your own personal quarters, whether that be on post or off post on the what they call the economy, which is where I lived. I lived with a German lady and a younger family at different points. Rented a room from them, and you know, it's just like living anywhere. In the field, when we went to the field, that'd be a totally different story. You were completely what they call tactical at the time you went out. You crossed a line of departure, at which point you were officially in the field, which meant you carried all your equipment, you carried your firearms with you. When you set up for the night, you established your local perimeter defense lines, your points of observation, and it was used as an opportunity to hone and retrain some of the skills that all the soldiers learn in basic training. You had an opportunity at that point to, you know, draw your different maps and check your orders, set your guards, things of that nature, and still conduct your repair mission at the same time. Unlike the infantry unit that goes out strictly to fight on the ground and maintain itself, a maintenance unit not only has to defend itself, but it also has to continue with its repair or support mission, whether it's a supply or maintenance company. So you have soldiers working during the day. At the same time, you have soldiers out on your perimeters, safeguarding, make sure that nobody sneaks up on you, catches you flat-footed. Sometimes it makes for pretty long days. Soldiers get pretty fatigued because they don't get a chance to rest, because those guards are kept up 24 hours a day. And it's a challenge to keep the soldiers motivated. It's a challenge to keep them motivated when you're out there for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. A lot of them were young soldiers that had young wives and children, and they were constantly worried about them. Many of them spoke no German. The wives didn't have a driver's license, or the troops didn't have a car to get around with. It was always something to try and keep their minds on their jobs and not on other aspects of their life, while important, but not the focus of what you were doing at the time. And sometimes that's a tough balance to maintain, you know, between the personal and the professional. So that was a challenge. Then every once in a while you'd have major exercises like Reforger, which was an acronym for Return of Forces to Germany. And that was a major exercise that would take place for about 3 to 4 weeks. The troops from the states that had overseas missions, in the event that there was a major deployment, say the Russians had decided to come across the border, certain stateside units had responsibilities and would be deployed to the European theater. And what would happen is they would in fact deploy. They'd come over for 2 weeks. Their equipment would be flown over. It would be delivered to the ports. Troops that were there in Germany would be assigned to the ports to help offload the same way they would have had there been actual hostilities. And our unit would go to the field in support of the divisional units. Every unit had its general deployment area where you went when the alert sounded, and from there it was fluid depending on what would happen. You might stay there for your entire 2 weeks, or you might be asked to pick up and move again, which in a support unit is that's an experience, because you have 3 times the amount of equipment that you have trucks for. So you can't just pick up your stuff and go at once. You usually make what they call 2 or 3 lifts, which means you leave stuff on the ground, come back and get it, leave stuff on the ground and come back and get it till you got everything.
Do you leave people with the stuff?
Yeah, so you've got troops on the ground where you're going, troops in transit, and troops on the ground behind you. So your unit is split up, could be over 20 or 30 miles, and maintaining communications and keeping track of where everybody is, hoping they don't get lost, is a large challenge in and of itself. Troops make the wrong turns, they get lost, trucks break down. Not everybody has a radio, not everybody has a way to communicate, and you spend your time, particularly as an officer, running back and forth from one point to the other, using your non-commissioned officers to assist you in that task. It's a pretty intense environment for a while. Keeps you busy. So,
in the course of what you call the regimented lifestyle, how far from your mind was the thought that the Russians might try something at the peak of the Cold War? Not the peak, but one of the peaks.
Yeah. I suppose the thought was always there. Sometimes you could forget it. And I know for a fact that there were times where I didn't think about it, particularly when your duties were fairly light, your workload was fairly light. A lot of times you'd go out and visit. In some instances, it was almost like you were on a paid vacation, being overseas and being in a foreign country and being able to travel around on the weekends fairly freely in Western Germany. But there were times when they called the alerts, which were practice runs. 99.9% of the time they were strictly practice and everybody knew it, and they almost always got called at the same time. It was always early morning, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, because you would be finished with your alert activities, getting everybody in, testing your recall procedures, and then you could fall into the routine of a normal day. But there were a couple of times where the alerts were called at odd hours. I particularly remember one. I don't recall the year, but it was the year the Korean airliner was shot down near the Russian boundaries. It was called late in the evening in Germany, and the officers' club was emptied. The post theaters were shut down. The laundries were shut down. The MPs actually went through the towns collecting up the soldiers, bringing them back to post. We were told to go pick up our basic ammunition loads. Actual ammunition was issued to soldiers, at which point all of a sudden it became very, very real to a number of people. You've got 18, 19-year-old kids straight out of basic training in some cases. Then you've got veterans who had served in Vietnam, who had seen contact, and things became very, very serious at that point. It was fun to talk about later, but at the time, the thoughts running through your head were, here we go. This is what we were trained for. This is what we're going to do. God, I hope I remember everything I need to do. But somehow you do it, and that's part of the training, part of the regimentation that you learn, because some things just click in then. You just find yourself doing things automatically without even thinking about it. You have a mental checklist you go right down, and you just do it, and all of a sudden you're amazed at how much you've done in how short a time.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the mental checklist?
There's always
different ones for different.
Yeah, there's a number of different things for what you're doing. First thing is to get yourself and your own stuff organized and keep it organized, and then you look to your people, make sure you've got everybody. You count noses. You check their equipment to make sure that their equipment is functional. You check to make sure that they know what they're doing, and then you start going down your checklist of where am I going, what am I doing, do I have everything I need to have packed for the first lift, what's important, what's not important, and then depending on what orders your company commanders received, you move from there. Sometimes you move, sometimes you don't. If you move, then you're busy organizing your equipment and your trucks and your transportation for your convoys, and making sure that in that case you're looking to make sure that the vehicles are fully fueled, make sure they've got all the oils and liquids that they need, make sure that they start. Hopefully they start. And if you're doing your maintenance ahead of time, then your equipment's in good shape. At the time, you've heard stories of Desert Storm, and most recently in Iraq, where weapons jammed due to poor maintenance. And it's very, very easy to do when you're in a maintenance unit or a support unit, because your emphasis is either providing the supplies or fixing the trucks, and you have to squeeze in your own personal maintenance time. It's like the story of a painting contractor whose house is always the worst painted because he spends his time painting everybody else's, or the mechanic's car that's falling apart because he spends all his time fixing other stuff. That same analogy could probably be applied to many of the support units too. You're spending so much time fixing other people's stuff that the time that you have for your own is fairly limited. And that's where it becomes key to make sure that you're not putting off the routine, dull, mundane tasks in peacetime, because if you do, you have nothing but problems when you have to use it. your equipment just doesn't function well under stress when it's not maintained. And that's probably one of the hardest things that you had to do was to maintain the will and the drive to do those kinds of things. So.
Do you remember, as part of your training as an officer, did the government train you or tell you anything in particular about the Russians? How to perceive them?
Yeah, well, there was always, there's always training in terms of what their tactics were, what type of equipment that they used. Not everybody got foreign language training. I wouldn't say we got any cultural training as far as that goes, but we would be kept abreast of any changes, where their forces were concentrated, what they were most likely to do, where their weak points were, and how to best, if you were in that kind of position, how best to function against what they had. Knowing what the range of their weapons were, knowing what the effectiveness of it was, knowing what their willingness to use chemical or biological weapons were, whether they'd use conventional warfare, or whether it would be a land invasion, or whether it be an airborne invasion, or whether it would be a bombing run. As a support unit in the rear area, our biggest concern would have been insertion of airborne troops to disrupt your local area, as well as aerial bombings. Those were probably our single largest concerns, along with local insurgents or guerrilla warfare. And that's probably one of the hardest things to teach people to defend against, because a lot of that stuff becomes will-o-wisp kind of activities, and it's very difficult and can be a very demoralizing kind of environment to have your soldiers in, because they become very confused. They don't know, they don't see their enemy, they don't know where their enemy is, and that's a challenge to lead against also.
Did you practice for that?
Absolutely. We would have internal, what they called reactionary forces, where soldiers, NCOs, and officers were designated. If something should happen within the confines of your area, there'd be a signal, and you'd rally on a certain point, and that would be your job. You would become the initial defense forces to help, throw your weaponry against whatever threat was there at the time. We would also be used to what they call sweep the area as advance parties before the bulk of the unit entered an area. And a lot of that is your basic, simple infantry style training. Everybody did it, male and female. It didn't matter. You were all soldiers at that point, and that was your primary responsibility if you were on one of those teams. As far as tactical trainings, one of the things that the senior officers in the battalion would do is they would hold officer development days. They would take us out as officers separately from the troops, similar to what we had done in advance camp. And as fellow lieutenants, we would serve as a team member while another lieutenant led, and then we would ultimately end up critiquing each other. And actually it worked out best, because a lot of times, sometimes you take recommendation and advice from your peers better than you do from your superiors. You always listen to what your superiors had to say, but it's the old, what does this guy know? He's old. But that didn't happen all that often. Usually you had enough confidence and respect in your senior leaders. And in my case, at the time I was in, many of them had combat experience from Vietnam, and they had valuable experience to share with you. So.
Can you try to explain how just the whole idea of a military enemy was formulated in the minds of the troops?
Well, with the Army, in the military as a whole, your enemy is basically established by your mission. It's the guy that can do most harm to you. It's the guy or the entity that has a threat to you. The enemy didn't necessarily have to be the Russians. It could have been a terrorist organization too. One of the favorites at the time was an organization called the Red Brigade. I believe they originated in Italy, but their sole purpose was to disrupt and destroy anything that they could to achieve their ends, whatever they were, whether it be getting comrades out of prison or just creating general mayhem. You had to teach people to pay attention to what was going on, to their own personal lives, even as individuals in the local communities. Oftentimes you get caught up in something like that. Perception of the enemy could change based on where you were stationed. If you were in Korea, the focus was the Koreans, or the Chinese, or the North Vietnamese. It all depends on what your specific mission was. In our case, it was the Soviet Union. That was the focus in Western Europe, and the safety, providing the safety and welfare of Western Europe at the time.
Do you remember your last day in Germany?
Not particularly. The last month or so was a total blur. I was a company commander, a headquarters detachment commander at the time. In that September we had a major deployment. We came back. We had a major corps level inspection. At the same time, I had to turn over company command, and that included a 30-day change of command inventory. That's something that every officer does when they're outgoing. They pass it off to the incoming commander. You inventory all your equipment, all your trucks, all your tools, all your bed linens. So within the space of about 60 days, I went through a 3-week major deployment, a 30-day change of command inventory, a major corps level inspection, and then I flew out. Not to mention having to pack up all my personal gear, make arrangements, ship my car back, travel to the port to deliver the car and get myself to the airport at the same time. So what happened on any specific day, all I remember is when I got back to the States and started school for the mid-level officer training course, it felt so good to be responsible just for myself. All I had to do was get up, be at class at 8 o'clock in the morning, and be in class until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, do the homework, and go back the next day.
How long did that last?
That was 6 months.
Okay.
That was a total of 6 months, and boy, was it a welcome break.
What sorts of things did you learn there?
The officer advanced course is designed to be the course that comes when you come back after you graduate from college. You go to your officer qualification basic course. Then you spend anywhere from 2 to 4 years in the field practicing the skills as a lieutenant. In that time frame, you're normally promoted to captain. If you come back at the 3-year mark, you're usually a captain. And the advanced course is used to prepare you for company command and staff officer training. Because up to that point, you've normally been serving either as an assistant staff officer or more likely as a platoon leader within a company. And the advanced course is to provide you with skills to command a company and serve as a primary staff officer, whether it be for logistics or intelligence or admin, personnel, that kind of stuff. I was in a little bit of a different position because I had already commanded at that point. And because of that, myself and about a half a dozen of my classmates who had also been in that position were often used as additional trainers for the rest of the class. You'd share your experiences, how you did certain things, how you managed to handle certain situations, because taking company command is a huge responsibility. And it's a very scary proposition sometimes, and you always wonder how well you're going to do. And there's always questions about how should I do this, how should I do that. And when you're in command, sometimes it's too late to ask the question because you're faced with the situation. Now you have to make the decision on your own. So in many cases, during the advanced course, like I said, my classmates and I were used as additional trainers, which was kind of nice because we had an opportunity to sit back and critique ourselves and then, provide some lessons learned, what to do and what not to do. What things will really get you in trouble. Because some people do well, some people do okay, and some do extremely well. It all depends on the kind of personality you have. So.
What happened next after training?
Because I'd had a company command, fortunately or unfortunately, I was reassigned right to the school I was assigned as what they called a small group instructor, and that was for the advanced course. So when...
And where was this?
This was at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. This was the U.S., what they called the United States Army Ordnance Center and School, and that's where all the maintenance soldiers came. Anybody who was assigned as a wheel or track vehicle mechanic, a small arms repairer, electronics repairer, anybody with those particular types of MOSs were sent to Aberdeen for their basic, what they called advanced individual training for the enlisted. There were NCO schools for the NCOs in the maintenance field, as well as the officer schools. And I was assigned to the department that dealt with the officers. And as a small group instructor, you took anywhere from 12 to 15 officers going through their advanced course, senior first lieutenants and captains, and you had them for approximately 12 weeks, and ran them through everything from small unit administration to tactics. They'd go out and they'd do training exercises. They would also go out and do what we called staff walks, which means we'd go to a local historic battlefield, and they would study the tactics and the maneuvers and strategies of the officers there, look at it and determine how they might have done differently or something like that. And from there, I was assigned as the Officer Basic Course Director, which meant I was responsible for the administration of all the incoming brand new lieutenants. That was a bit of a challenge, particularly in the second half of my tenure there in the 18 months that I held that position, because the last 8 or 9 months of that was during Desert Storm, the first Gulf War. And that was a bit of a scary proposition, because before a lieutenant could be deployed overseas, they had to go through their initial training courses. There were a lot of Guard and reservists that were coming through that had to be certified, and because of that, you had to make darn certain that they knew what they were doing. On top of that, the Guard and Reserve units were being deployed to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and they went through a certification course before they were allowed to leave the States to enter the Gulf area, making sure that they understood what they had to do, making sure that their weapons and equipment worked properly, making sure that they understood the proper tactics and protection, with a huge emphasis on the chemical biological aspect of warfare.
Can you tell me how they prepared the troops for that, or prepared the officers for that?
For the officers, there was a heavy emphasis on individual small unit skills, which meant a lot of time spent utilizing the chemical alarm gear. There's a number of different types of instruments that the Army uses for early warning. There's a number of types of test kits that you use to determine what kind of chemicals were used. You had to make sure that people understood and knew what kind of reactions were created by nerve agents or biological agents, so that you knew how to react to it. How to decontaminate equipment, how to decontaminate personnel, how to prevent the spread of contamination, how to read weather patterns to judge the severity of what could happen to you. Even if you weren't necessarily in an area that had been struck, you needed to know what kind of threat an area 40 or 50 miles away might present to you at what time, and be able to make decisions based on that. Because putting your troops into protective gear too soon fatigues them. It's a very difficult thing to wear for an extended period of time, because you're totally encased, a lot of it being plastic and rubber, and you know what happens when you put on a sauna suit. You just roast. And when you're wearing those kinds of equipment, it's a very fatiguing environment. You end up with a lot of heat casualties. You had to teach people how to care for those heat casualties, how to prevent the heat casualties, because the last thing you wanted to do was to reduce your effective strength by having people in the hospital. Not to mention the fact that health or heat injuries can be deadly by themselves. A lot of physical conditioning took place, because particularly with the Guard and Reserve units, they don't receive near the level of physical conditioning that an active unit would receive. simply because you're not there 5 days a week. You're not conducting organized physical fitness, and unless a person is pretty dedicated to maintaining their own physical fitness, a lot of them weren't necessarily in the shape that they needed to be in. And there's a lot of truth to physical fitness being allowing you to do your job properly without making a lot of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
The more physically fit you are, the less fatigued you become. The less fatigued you become, the less likely you are to make poor decisions. That's a very difficult thing. It was a very demanding time, and some of it entailed changing outlook and attitude and perspective of the Guard or reservist who had only done it for the weekend and now was thrust into it full time, and they hadn't made that mental jump from civilian to military life yet. And there is a distinct difference between military and civilian lifestyles. The military, you do what you're told when you're told. There's a time to question and a time not to question. And in the civilian world, it's totally different. There's a lot of questioning that goes on before people do anything. And that's not necessarily particularly advantageous situation in the military. A lot of times things are done just because they're done that way, and the people above you know more than you do in many cases about why you're doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It may seem silly to you what you're doing, but in retrospect, when you go back and look at it, it had a very valid reason. But you don't always have time to explain and understand what it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's where having the respect of your troops comes in handy.
Mm-hmm.
Have the confidence that they have in you that you're going to do right by them, that whatever you do is going to have their best interests at heart while you're doing what you have to do. And that's not an easy thing to achieve sometimes, particularly with the various backgrounds of the soldiers that you have. You could have a soldier from the inner city, and you could have a soldier from Appalachia. You could have a soldier who could barely read and write, and you could have a soldier who had a master's degree and just decided to enlist for something different. You have a wide range, and it's definitely a challenge, and it's definitely worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot of fun too.
When did you first hear that the troops were going to go to Kuwait?
In the first Gulf War, I don't know what I couldn't put my finger on the official time that I knew, but there were signs that you could see that there was a buildup, particularly in the support corps,
Mm-hmm.
because it takes so long from deployment to get something ready. There were a lot of things that were happening administratively, like reassignment of people, freezing reassignments, freezing resignations, freezing putting in what they call a stop loss, which means even if you were going to separate, you were involuntarily extended sometimes. They were not accepting officer resignations. What that did is that cut down on turnover. Priority units were suddenly getting filled. You could have seen officers at Aberdeen that were supposed to go to, some, as a active duty cadre to a guard unit, all of a sudden being diverted to the 1st Infantry Division or the 3rd Infantry Division or the 1st Armored or something like that. Orders were cut to divert people. So the line between officially knowing and seeing things that were going on, it kind of becomes blurred.
Mm-hmm.
If you watch what's going on, sometimes you sense what's going to happen before anybody says anything. Mm-hmm. It's just one of those things that you learn. You start to see things, you start to hear orders. All of a sudden, requisitions that weren't being filled because of budgetary concerns were all of a sudden dropping on your desk. You were getting inundated with things that you'd been crying for months, but were on the back burner because the funding wasn't there. And all of a sudden, now you've got it.
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things were happening. I remember at the time, my brother was assigned to Kaneohe Marine Air Station in Hawaii, and he had gotten the word that he was deploying, and that was probably the end of July. mid to latter part of July in 1990. And again, when the Marines get deployed, you pretty much know that there's something big in the wind because they're the first ones in, and then the Army comes in to hold the territory afterwards. So, you start to see the Marines moving, sometimes something's up, particularly when people who don't normally deploy are heading out.
When was your brother deployed?
In August of 1990. He was one of the first Marine units that got deployed. The units from Hawaii went to Kuwait very, very early on. I do remember the day that the air war started because it was a strange celebration for my birthday. The air war started on January 16th of 1991, and I was on my way into work that day, and didn't realize exactly what was going to happen at Aberdeen, but they closed off all the entrances to the base except for one. And you don't realize how many people work at Aberdeen until there's only one gate for everybody to go through, and everybody has to stop, show ID, and have their vehicles checked before they can go through. There was probably a 3-mile backup on I-95 of people waiting to get off the exit to get into Aberdeen Proving Ground, and the exit was probably 1.5 to 2 miles from the base entrance. So it was a fairly large backup. It took me about 3 or 4 hours to get into post that morning. And at that point, it wasn't worth going home for. I just stayed. But
how long did you stay?
I stayed probably I think it was for 2 days. I stayed on post. I stayed with some friends that lived in quarters there. But
what did you have to do?
Nothing specific other than our normal schedule. We continued because we were at the school and we had certain routines that we had to follow. We had classes in session at the time. And we had units on post being certified. We just continued with that. The only difference is we probably stepped up the pace because we anticipated quicker, earlier deployments because of it. So 8-hour days probably became 10-hour days. But it was just one of those things that nobody thought twice about. It just sort of came naturally. You just sort of did what you did.
Did you have any personal feelings about the war in Kuwait?
There's always two sets of feelings. One is the political and one is the personal. I don't think at the time I necessarily disagreed with the political reasons for it. Being in a position and knowing what your army can do, you certainly don't want another guy's army to do to you what you could potentially do to them. And given the fact that it was a fairly unstable area, I didn't necessarily have a problem politically with it. On a personal note, I think I spent several days on personal reflection. I wasn't in an assignment where I was going to be deployed initially because I wasn't with a unit that was deployable.
And you knew that up front.
I knew that up front because what was getting deployed were infantry units, armor units, maintenance companies, and being assigned to the school. The school cadre wasn't deployable as a unit. But what you were deployable as is you were, each individual on post was prioritized based on their rank, whether you would be the first, second, third, or fourth to go if there was need of individual replacements. And I think at the time, the thought that went through my mind was, geez, I missed the opportunity to go because I'm not with a unit. I wanted to go because that's what you trained for, but you didn't want to go because you knew it was a very dangerous environment to be in. It's not necessarily something you look forward to doing, but then again, having been trained for it, that's your job and that's what you train for, so you sometimes want to test yourself. And then when you think about the position that I was in, I thought about it. Being an individual replacement, I was going over because there was a vacancy. And the most primary reason for a vacancy would be for a casualty, which means somebody was extremely wounded or had been killed. And when you stop and you think about why you're backfilling somebody, the dangers become very, very real to you. And all of a sudden you're looking at leaving everything behind, and it's a scary thought. and particularly as a woman looking to go into the Gulf area, which is a Muslim-oriented area in which women in positions of authority are not plentiful. That would have been an additional challenge, particularly since I was an officer and would have been in a position to be giving orders and be giving commands and being in a position of authority, much more so than many of the enlisted soldiers. That thought kind of concerned me, how that would play not only with the bad guys on the other side, but how it would play with our other Muslim and Arab allies on our side. Because even while they, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are fairly, what I always say, forward in their acceptance of women, there's still a line that isn't crossed. And having talked to people who'd been there, it was a difficult line to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
You're not the assertive, aggressive female that you are in the States. You have to learn a little bit more diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that thought kind of concerned me as to how to function in the proper role without antagonizing somebody else. That was a different thought to carry, as opposed to when we went to Panama or Grenada, where that particular facet didn't enter into the realm of how do you do your job. But fortunately, I didn't have to deal with that. I did have to deal with making sure, and I was very, very concerned about the lieutenants that were graduating. We were probably very, very hard on a number of them. There were a number of them that did not get certified. I say a number, maybe 1 or 2%, that we washed out of the program. And that created its own problems, particularly with the Guard or Reserve unit. A lot of times they'd write to their state senators, this person has a degree, college degree, they've gotten their commission, why did you take it away from them? And it's difficult to quantify sometimes, but you just know that there's a person who, while their heart is in the right place, just isn't capable of providing the leadership that they need to be in.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to make that call and say, you just are not going to go, you are just not going to be an officer, it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. What happened to these people? Were they just put back? Were they eliminated from the military altogether?
Yeah,
Okay.
they were all discharged.
Okay.
Their commissions were, I forget the actual term, but they lost their commissions. Their service was terminated, unless, of course, they were in some sort of program with a Guard unit in which they took tuition assistance, in which case some of them reverted to enlisted rank. And that in itself can cause a problem, particularly if you revert to an enlisted rank in the same unit that you were in.
Right.
That can cause some problems. I don't know that I particularly want to do that myself after having been an officer and then becoming an enlisted person in the same unit.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be difficult to step away from that position of authority and not cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me, it would. I don't know how I'd have dealt with it. And I don't know what happened to any of those that did. I suspect that they probably severed their association with the service entirely at that point. But it was not unusual to have congressmen call and demand an answer. You'd have lawyers, parents would engage lawyers, and it's just you have to make a decision. What's more important, the career of one person or the lives of the platoon that they were going to be leading? And it was a difficult choice. It wasn't one that was made lightly either. Because in some cases, you were taking away a person's career, which meant they had to go back to square one and start over with something else. And that's not an easy thing to do, particularly for somebody who lived in perhaps an area of a state that was economically depressed. That was their moneymaker. That was how they were going to survive. And they didn't go. But unfortunately, you have to live with that. And then you find out that you passed somebody that didn't do well. You find out that you passed somebody that cracked under the pressure, couldn't deal with it.
Did that happen often?
Not really, but there were those that didn't deal well with it, and they finished out their assignments and then ultimately resigned. That's one of the, I guess you could say, one of the benefits of being an officer, unlike an enlisted person. If you enlisted sign a term of enlistment for 2, 3, 4 years, an officer comes in, they take their commission, and they can apply for resignation at any time. Whether or not it's accepted is another story, but if you find that you're in over your head, you can put in your papers and ask to be released. And some did that. Some decided that this wasn't what they were looking for. Others decided that, well, I took it for college tuition. I took it for an opportunity to make some money, but hey, I kind of like this and I'm good at it, and they end up making it a career. You know, it's interesting to see people bloom in different directions. So.
When did you decide to get out of the military?
It was after Desert Storm. I stayed the entire time that we were in conflict over there until they redeployed everything. And then it was one of those situations where I was up for reassignment. I had not planned necessarily to make it a career. Originally it was a 4 years and out routine, but at that point there were some personal considerations with family members that had contracted a long-term illness. I had 2 brothers who were in the service at that time, one in the Army, one in the Marine Corps. And my life was taking a little bit of a different direction in terms of what I wanted out of life. And I opted to leave active duty. I retained my commission in the reserves for another 2 years, at which point I ended up with a disability rating, and then I ended up resigning my reserve commission too. It was much more of a personal decision than a like or dislike to leave the military. I don't think the military had anything to do with my decision to leave. It was more where I wanted to go with the rest of my life kind of attitude. I wanted to do certain things, and if I stayed with the military, I wouldn't be able to do them in the time frame that I wanted to do them in. So I opted to resign at that point. Kept a 2-year commission in the reserves, and then I separated from the reserves.
During your entire time in the military, did you stay in contact with your family?
Oh, absolutely.
Did you call? Did you write? Did you?
Yeah, both. You know, you were granted leave. I came home on leave one year. I bought airfare tickets for my parents to come over and visit. That was a Christmas present one year. So they came to visit me. Actually, they came twice. I paid for their tickets the first time. They enjoyed themselves, so they came back a second time. I went home once. Every once in a while, you make a long-distance call. Letters. I remember one particular communication from home. The Army has what they call, or the military has what they call the Stars and Stripes. It's a newspaper that's published by the military. And I picked it up one day, and one of the headings on it says, "Robot finds criminals." And I started reading it, and the byline caught my attention because it was dated Elmira, New York. And I started to read, and it was a story of how there had been a gun battle in the city of Elmira, and that they had called in a robot to go in and find out where the bad guys were in the building, which was over in the area of Jones Court. And it didn't mention any names. It just mentioned that there had been a police officer wounded and one had been killed. And at that point, I kind of sort of went into a tailspin, because here I am sitting in Germany. It's an activity happening in Elmira, and my father's a member of the police department as well as the SWAT team leader. And while it didn't specifically say who, I knew that the SWAT, based on the situation, the SWAT team had to be involved. I tried to call home. The line's busy for probably 12 hours. I tried to call. Couldn't get a hold of anybody. Tried to call some other relatives. The phone would ring or the line was busy. Finally, I got through to a next-door neighbor and asked him to hook up with my parents and have them give me a call and let me know what was going on. Fortunately, it didn't involve my father. Wasn't any of the casualties, but it was kind of a unique way to get news from home.
Your father was involved in it, though?
Yes. Yeah, he was the SWAT team leader at the time. That's a whole nother story in and of itself, but news from home comes in strange packages. You get your Christmas packages, you get your care packages from home. People send you all kinds of stuff. Yeah, you take them in, you share them with everybody. You know, you get a package, you share everything you got with everybody else, and when they get one, they share with you too. So it's always fun to see what you get.
What was most prized? Food or?
Probably it was a food item. For me, it was trying to think. Funny as it sounds, homemade bagels was the thing that I liked getting the most. Other people, cookies and brownies and a lot of sweet tooth. The candy in Europe was different than the candy in the United States, and while you could get it on post, sometimes there were things that the exchange didn't buy that people would get from home. If they could have sent pizza, I would have liked to have pizza. The Western European pizzas are not American pizzas. They don't do hamburgers well. Somehow buying a McRib sandwich at McDonald's in Germany just wasn't the same. You could do that, but it just wasn't the same. But I think the two things that I probably missed were pizza and burgers the most. But there were a lot of other things to make up for it. So.
Do you remember any period of time, like for instance, when the Korean airliner was shut down? What did your family desperately try to contact you at any time?
No,
they may have heard in the news.
I don't think my parents really gave that much of a thought, because I was on one side of the globe and that action happened on the other, and I don't think people that weren't connected probably realized how much of an impact that one incident might have had on the entire military. Not knowing why it went down, or who or what, you don't know whether that was a prelude to something else. So that one incident, in the Sea of Japan had
anything about that happened during the Persian Gulf War that you don't believe the public is generally aware of?
It's tough to tell. Just thinking back to more recently, with my brother being in the current Gulf War, there are things that go on that you probably, the general public at large doesn't understand or doesn't know. I would have to say troop movements, maybe, how people got from one place to the other, how you ended up being, how troops on the ground ended up being where they were and what they ended up doing. It's tough to really put your finger on it, especially now, because I'm on the outside looking in and knowing what I know about how the military operates. I would have to say that their lifestyle, the types of activities that they're involved in, the day-to-day drudgery that people have, the troops go through. I would have to say the individual guard mounts that the soldiers pull, the individual details. The days they're long and hard. Probably something that most people here wouldn't have any opportunity to actually partake in. I think probably the closest would be a construction worker who's out there 12 hours a day in all kinds of weather, when the weather's good, trying to get a project completed. I suspect that they're probably the closest that come to that kind of physical involvement. It's tough to know what's going on. You see the news and you hear about the 3rd Infantry Division or the 4th Infantry Division or the 1st Armored Division, but that doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what they're doing. You hear about what the generals are doing, what the activities are on a grand scale, but when you're involved with somebody in Company B of the 1st Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, what is that company doing? And you hear about an engagement where the 1st Armored Division was involved in this heavy firefight, and that particular unit may or may not be involved. It isn't until days later sometimes that you find out. It was particularly during the first Gulf War, there was a big concern about rear area security. In fact, the single largest casualty activity happened when the Scud missile landed on the quartermaster unit. They were far from the front lines. They were never engaged. They were involved in a rear area support operation, and that's a case where a long-range missile reached out and touched somebody that wasn't supposed to be actively engaged in combat. Those are the kinds of things I think that the public doesn't necessarily know what's going on. And I'm not sure there's any way to teach them how to do that. Because once you start broadcasting that level of detail, then you have to worry about tactical concerns and security of your personnel, where they are, what they're doing. That has to be balanced. I'm sure that there were things that took place that nobody's heard about yet. It's hard to put your finger on it. Convoy operations, like what happened to the 507th Maintenance Company during this Gulf War, those are the kinds of things that we were training units to avoid here in the States during the first Gulf War. Convoy operations and convoy security, what to do, how to do it, how to defend against it, how to prevent yourself from being in those kinds of positions. It started with a wrong turn, and it just went progressively worse from there. And that's why, when I talked earlier about being tough on the lieutenants, they have to know how to read maps. They can't make a mistake. A lot of times, folks today grow up in a culture where, well, you know, I took a test, I got a 90, I only missed one. Or I only missed one question. Why is it such a big deal? Why are you on my case? Well, if you're off by a digit on a grid coordinate on a map, it's a big deal. Things like what happened to the 507th happened. They have a huge impact when you make a mistake. And those are the kinds of things that I think about today when I think about what we did during the first Gulf War at Aberdeen, preparing those officers and those units to go over. You know, the smallest little detail, you forget to tell them something. It's like, oh God, I hope I remember to emphasize this. I hope they remember this. There's a lot of hindsight. You know, should we have taught them this? Should we have taught them that? Should we have emphasized this? That kind of stuff. But there's nothing that can prepare you for all eventualities. You can only do the best you can do, and hope people apply their training the way it's supposed to happen. And I think what happened with the 507th happens more often than not. There are other activities where things like that happen. I had friends that would tell me stories of soldiers who were put on guard posts that fell asleep. They'd have to be awoken. That's a scary thought. People just get tired, and where they don't see the need for it. The day-to-day administration, the usual discipline that goes on. I think it's daily life that the public doesn't see. I mean, they see the big things, the battles and the conflicts, and you know, the parades and the movements and things like that. But the day-to-day life of what a soldier actually goes through, I don't think the public at large necessarily has a full understanding of what soldiers and troops go through. It can be a grueling lifestyle sometimes. It can be fun at times. It can be drudgery at times. It can be exciting. It can be scary. But I think in the long run, the ties that you form and the relationships you form are all worth it. You get a sense of accomplishment when it's done. that you've done something, that you've made a difference. Even if it's just in one person or in one job, you've had an opportunity to make an impact somewhere. It definitely was worth it. I wouldn't trade the experiences. As much as I grump sometimes, I wouldn't trade the experiences.
Are you involved in veterans organizations now?
Yes, I'm a member of the American Legion right now, and I'm involved in a history group that is responsible for remembering veterans' contributions in the past. I still actively support both my brothers, who are both still active duty. One's a major in the Army, and the other's a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, who's been told he probably will be going back again to the Gulf in probably August sometime, or early summer. He expects to be redeployed again. Not that he's particularly crazy about it. It'll be his third time in 10 years. And he'd just as soon stay in the desert in California, fires or no fires. Yeah, we still go. I've got friends that are members of the VFW, the Legion, and the Vietnam Veterans Associations, activities like that. I make it a point to celebrate the different holidays, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, things like that. I make it a point to stop by and talk to the folks.
Mm-hmm.
It means a lot to them to be remembered.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly the Vietnam veterans and the Korean veterans that are around. A lot of the World War II veterans are no longer with us, but the Korean and Vietnam vets really appreciate being remembered, and they appreciate somebody thinking about what they did, because they had both of them were pretty nasty operations. One was cold and one was hot. So,
when you first entered the ROTC program, what percentage of potential officers out there were women?
Oh, I'm trying to think. I want to say there were, in my freshman class, I want to say there were 30 of us, and maybe I remember three or four of us being women at the time. My roommate was one. Didn't know it at the time until I ran into her at drill that day. It's like, oh, I know you, which was kind of a nice thing, because being in the ROTC program on the Syracuse University campus, while not necessarily an unpopular association, wasn't necessarily high on the list of organizations that people wanted to be a part of. Syracuse tended to be a little bit of a liberally based organization. A lot of rallies, a lot of student activism, and the ROTC department was a lightning rod for a lot of those kinds of activities. I mean, you weren't harassed to a large extent, but there were certain places that you didn't wear your uniform. There were certain classes that you found it more to your advantage to change out of your uniform before you went to class. Other classes, it didn't matter. It depended. In fact, in some classes, they encouraged it, because it caused a lot more open discussion. Other classes, it just caused grief for you.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And by the time you left the military, even when in Aberdeen, how many women did you work with then?
There were quite a few more at the time. I want to say maybe out of maybe a third of the classes were female. Mm-hmm. in the officers corps. They certainly weren't, and I don't want to say unfortunately, but my numbers are probably more skewed because the Ordnance Corps it's in a traditionally male field, mm-hmm. Mechanics and auto mechanics and things of that nature. So it's not a branch of service that women naturally gravitate to. In my first company, when I was reassigned to Germany, I was the only female lieutenant. I had one female mechanic out of 30, and she didn't stay long. It was a traditionally male field, much as mechanics are still a traditionally male field. The military as a whole is traditionally male. It requires some adjustment on your part to fit into the mentality and understand what's going on, and to accept what's going on sometimes. But there were definitely more women that were involved when I separated from the military. A lot more women were becoming non-commissioned officers. But again, in the enlisted ranks, there weren't nearly as many women under an officer's supervision as there were officers. And a lot of that, again, I attribute to the fact that it was not a traditionally female calling. I mean, not many women enlist in the military to become a mechanic. You find them in other roles. You find them becoming truck drivers. The administrative field is full of them. In fact, to the point sometimes where the number of women are restricted so it doesn't get too out of balance. And I know there's a larger number of senior field grade military women than there ever was before. They're starting to break into the general officer ranks with regularity now. Although the top ranks will probably almost always be male, simply because to achieve those ranks, some of the higher general officer ranks are achieved through combat experiences, which are limited for women. I don't think you'll ever see a woman general in charge of an infantry unit. I don't think that'll ever happen. I don't think you'll ever see them in charge of an artillery or a tank unit either. And those are the kinds of roles that lead to the more senior levels in the military structure. Not to say that there won't be sometime, but I think the opportunity is somewhat limited and somewhat restricted, and it would take a very, very special person to get to that point. It would take an enormous amount of leadership ability. But it's not undoable.
Okay. Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you would like to say?
There's always stories to tell. Some funny and some not so funny. Some that you'd never share with people, just because you wouldn't. I mean, things that seemed like mountains and very, very important at the time. In retrospect, you look back and say, "God, I can't believe that I worried about that." I'll never forget my first major IG inspection. They had what they called Inspector General inspections, and they were career makers or breakers. If you did well, you did well. If you did poorly, oh boy, were you in trouble. And the first one arrived. I had been in country and in my unit less than 90 days when the first one showed up in our company. And you hear all these horror stories of people being relieved and kicked out, and just awful things happening to them. And I'd gone through my platoon. I'd gone through the barracks. We'd set everything up. Their clothes were dressed. Their records were dressed right. Everything. We polished the floors. We polished the brass. Some places across posts, they painted the grass so when the helicopter came in, all they saw was green instead of brown spots. I mean, silly things like that. The inspector walks into one of my troops' rooms, opens the wall lockers, goes through it, does a lot of humping and harumphing, and then he opens up the small dorm-style refrigerators that the troops were allowed to have in their rooms. And I was feeling pretty good at the time because we'd gone through, defrosted everything. Everything had been wiped down. He wasn't going to find anything in there that was going to cause a problem. He opened up the refrigerator, and in the refrigerator there was a very, very small freezer section. In the freezer section, he pulls out a box of Steakums. And while I wasn't necessarily concerned about it, I could feel that this was not going to go the right way. I could feel a pit in my stomach. And the inspector turns around and looks at the soldier and asks him if those steakums belong to him. Yes, sir. He said, I understand you're not allowed to cook in the rooms. Oh, no, sir, we can't. Well, I realize you have a barbecue pit out back, but how do you do steakums on a barbecue pit? Yeah, that's not the kind of thing that you could put on a grill. And the troop turns around and he says, well, that's real easy, sir. He reaches into his wall locker and he turns around and he's got 2 irons in his hand. One is a fairly large surface that's wrapped with tin foil, and the other one's a smaller one. He says, I have 2 irons. One I use to iron my uniforms, and this is the one I plug in and I put the steakums on top of. At that point in time, I just knew that my career was over, because the troops, the reason they weren't allowed to cook in the rooms is hot plates and heating devices were considered a safety hazard because they could be put in the wall lockers and it'd start a fire. I just knew my career was over. The inspector turns around, his face was just as red as a beet, and I knew he was about ready to take my head off. And he turns around and he says, Lieutenant, meet me outside. So we go outside, and he's standing outside the room, and he's got tears running out of his eyes. He thought it was hilarious. He thought it was, he'd never heard anything like that before, and I was mortified. I just knew. I knew my career was over in 90 days. And that's the kind of level of detail that they went through. And at the time, I must have had an ulcer over that. Looking back at it, in retrospect, it's like, it seems so silly, but, you know,
Did you have to discipline the troop?
No.
Was he allowed to continue cooking his
No,
steakums?
no. We went back and we explained to him, you know, look, the whole idea, you know, and even the irons, they weren't kept in the wall lockers. They were normally put up on top, so they didn't come in contact with clothing when they were hot. And just trying to explain to him why was something else. Yeah. Then there were incidents. You know, you talk about daily life and daily incidents. You had your share of drug problems. You had your share of, you know, the typical theft and things like that you had to deal with. Troops would get drunk. They'd have accidents. They'd hurt themselves. You had asked earlier about things that the public doesn't generally know about. With the current war, there's always something on every day about another troop being killed or wounded or something like that. And almost every day on an active military post, there's an accident of some sort. I don't think the public realizes how dangerous an occupation military is even in peacetime. There's a number of deaths on a regular basis from training accidents. Trucks overturn, weapons explode, ordnance explodes. The soldiers, every once in a while a soldier will kill another soldier. There's any one of a number of ways, and it's not unusual to have a death on a post. And the public, I don't think, ever really hears about it. The local towns or populace around the post might hear about it, but overseas, I don't. You know, with the exception of the individual family member that it happens to, I don't think the public at large realizes how many deaths there are in the military, just from non-combat causes. Mm-hmm. I remember one. It was the first one I had come in contact with. I was assigned as the investigating officer for it because every time there's an accident like that, the military assigns what they call a disinterested officer, a disinterested party, somebody that's not a member of the unit to investigate it to determine whether or not it was preventable, wasn't preventable, was somebody at fault, was somebody not at fault, was it truly an accident, was it negligence. And the first one I was assigned, the 3rd Infantry Division had been given the new M1 Abrams tank. They had traded in their M60s and gotten the M1s. And they were on the range conducting laser training fire. And the M1 had a mechanism in it so that even once the gun locked onto a target, even if the elevation of the tank itself changed, say it went down into a like a small swell or into a small ditch, the gun barrel would automatically readjust and stay locked on that particular target. And when they were on the training range, there was an extra radio placed inside the track, because the radio in the track was used by the tank commander to communicate with his staff inside the tank. The range training officer had to communicate from the outside in for the administrative purposes, so there was an additional radio that had been placed in the tank. And in this particular instance, the individual, to reach the radio, you were supposed to reach underneath the tube inside, the gun tube inside the tank to get to the radio. For some reason, this individual either forgot, wasn't told, didn't pay attention. He reached over the gun tube, and the tank in its movements, the gun tube shifted, and he was caught between the roof of the tank and the tube itself. And that was a pretty messy deal. It was not a fun thing. Guys get caught between vehicles all the time. They get crushed between vehicles. Vehicles overturn. Vehicles burn. There's a lot of ways people can get hurt. And I think that's probably the one thing the public at large probably doesn't realize. It's hard to say it's the cost of doing business, but it's not unexpected. Unfortunately, it hurts when it happens, but it does happen.
Did you ever have to deal with the families when? Did you lose anyone from your?
I didn't have any directly in my company or in my platoon. It was always dealing with.
As the disinterested.
Yeah, always dealing with other soldiers. The hard part being, if you investigated a death, I had two of these, was trying to explain to the families of suicide victims what happened, because depending on how the investigations were written and the circumstances surrounding the suicides, the family may or may not receive the group life insurance payment, or they may or may not receive any benefits. And in the cases where benefits are denied, it's a very, very difficult situation to explain why you made the decision that you did. It's not a pleasant situation. Something that you don't necessarily want to do, but it happens even on the outside with personal life insurance policies. There are exclusions too, and that's got to be probably the toughest thing to explain, that I had to explain to somebody. But within my own organization, we didn't have any immediate deaths within our organization. So.
Is there anything else you'd like to say today?
Not today. I could probably talk forever, and if I sat down with a couple other folks and we started trading stories, we'd probably come up with a dozen more.
Mm-hmm.
They come to mind as you go.
Okay.
So.
Well, for now, thank you very much. If you ever want to do this again, let me know. We'll do another tape.
No problem.
Thank you, Terry.
Mm-hmm.